So here is what we call the simplex method. Now this one's a little bit more confusing. So I'll talk to you a little bit about it, and then we'll go through some problems here. The objective function that we're going to look at, we're not going to be talking about minimal anymore. We're just straight up maximizing. All the variables here are non-negative. So we're assuming the first quadrant. So x1, or we're not assuming, we're just assuming that they're not going to be negative. Sorry, we're not. Forget the quadrant part. We're going to look at non-negative. So instead of using x and y like we did earlier, or x, y, and z in the 3 variable, or even more letters here, we're going to use x1, x2, x3, x4, depending on how many variables there are in the problem. Because in a business model, there are theoretically a whole bunch of variables. So the constraints are going to involve less than or equal to. So all our constraints are going to be less than or equal to from the left to the right. All the values on the right side, however, of the constraints are going to be non-negative. So it's going to be less than or equal to a positive number or 0 at worst. We will use what's called a simplex tableau. A tableau is almost like it's a matrix that has values inside, and I'll show you how to do it in a minute. And what are called slack variables. These are going to pick up the slack to make less than to turn into equals, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. There is a pivot column with the most negative indicator, where a pivot row will be determined. Now, this is hard to understand here, but keep in mind pivot column, pivot row, and I'll explain that in a while. Where the pivot row and pivot column intersect, we're going to be what's called the pivot. It's going to be a number that lives in a specific row and column in a matrix. That's going to be very, very important. So we're going to try to make the pivot to equal to 1, and every other number in the column above the line, above, let's see, above and below the pivot to be 0. So we're going to look at every number in the same column where the pivot is. We're going to get them all to be 0, above and below. If there are other negative indicators after we did the pivot, then we're going to find the next pivot and keep going. This process is called pivoting. Okay? Which kind of makes sense that we're going to get the pivot. It's weird. We will examine the tableau to determine the values for x1, x2, s1, s2. These are slack variables. And z is going to be the objective function. This will lead us to the maximum value, including basic and non-basic variables, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. So all this is just vocabulary. So let me walk you through this. Man, it's going to be kind of tough to see here a little bit, but let's see. Here's a given problem. Suppose you have z equals 4x1 plus 3x2. Now, imagine, if you will, this was like 4y plus 3, or 4x plus 3y. And this is x plus y, or 5x plus 2y, or x plus 2y, x and y. But for right now, because we might have more than 3 or 4 or 5 many variables, we use little subscripts of 1 and 2, 3, 4, and so on. So notice that all the constraints are less than or equal to here. Now this part, these has to be they have to be non-negative. So the variable part, x's, x1, x2, x3, all those x's have to be greater than or equal to 0. That's non-negotiable. These other constraints have to be less than or equal to 0. These other constraints have to be less than or equal to. The numbers on the right here have to be positive, or at worst 0. So if x plus 1 is less than or equal to 10, that means that these two numbers could possibly be less than 10. So I want to add something to it to make it equal to 10. So we add what's called slack variable 1, s1. So if I add s1 to x1, if I add s1 to these two things, that's going to sort of pick up the slack, so to speak. That's why we call it a slack variable. So we change these less thans to straight up equals by adding this unknown entity, slack variable. So s1 to this one, s2 to this one, s3 to this one. So the slack variables are just 1, 2, 3, as many as you need until you turn them into equals. Now, your objective function, I'm going to put it underneath. Because it's weird, because the objective function, you want to have one side of the equal side 0. So the idea here is to move everything to the left. By moving, you have to subtract. 4x1 from both sides and 3x1 from 3x2 from both sides. So you're gonna put like in this order: x1 first, and x2, then the z, then the right. Like since all this goes to the right, this becomes 0 here. So these three, along with this one, become your four values that you're gonna put into what's called a tableau. So keep in mind these values. If I can get that, if I can see that here. So if I can get it all in there. Yeah. So you're gonna put these four into 4 rows. So because I'm gonna look at all my values, I'm gonna have x1, x2, then I'm gonna put my slack variables after s1, s2, s3, then a z variable. So I'm gonna have my x's, x1, x2, x3, depending on what I need. In this case, 1 and 2, x1, x2. Then I have s1, s2, s3. Then my objective function, my z value. So in here are gonna go coefficients. So in the first one, you see the first equation, x1 plus x2 plus s1 equals 10. So x1 has a 1 in front, x2 has a 1 in front. 1, 1. S1 has a 1 in front also. There is no S2 or S3 in here, so I put zeros. And equals to 10, 10 I put to the right. There is no Z as well. And the second one, notice 5 for x1, 2 for x2, 5 and a 2. Then I have no S1. I have S2 to be 1, or 1 in front. Then no S3 and no Z. And the third one, I notice I have 1, 2. Then I have 0 and 0 for S1 and S2. Then S3, I have a 1 in front. No Z, and then equals to 36. The last one here is under this line. This is my objective function. -4, -3 for x and y, x1, x2. 0 for the 3 slack variables because there's no s's in here. And Z has a 1 in front. On the right-hand side is equal to 0. So all of this, I put it into this matrix, which we call a tableau, a simplex tableau. It's weird. So that's what I'm looking at now. So I'm going to turn the page and kind of go pivoting. So this things that you see circle here are what they call a pivot row and a pivot column. So let me explain what that is. You start down here with your x1, x2, because by default, these are going to have to be negatives because originally they were positive in the first one, because your objective function will be positive. So out of these two, you pick the one that's most negative, meaning it's the biggest number that has a negative sign in front of it, or what's called, or the which one's to the left of which. So the biggest negative, the largest negative is -4. So out of these two, -4 is bigger. So this would be my pivot row, my pivot column. So this is my pivot column. So along this column, there are 4 values. So in here, to figure out which row is in my pivot row, I'm going to take this number on the right, and I'm going to divide by this number on the left. So 10 divided by 1 is 10. Then I'm going to take 20 divided by 5, I get 4. Then 36 divided by 1, I get 36. Now keep in mind, these have to be positive. If any of them are negative, they cannot be included in this division. So we're looking at positive values. So once you do this, the smallest of the 3 answers, 4, represents your pivot row. So where the pivot column kind of intersects with the pivot row, 5. That's what we call the pivot. So this is the pivot. So we want to do pivoting. So this number, we have to essentially change it to 1. And the only way we can do this mathematically is if we divide the whole set of numbers here by 5. So 5 over 5 is 1, 2 over 5, 0 over 5, 1 over 5, 0 over 5, 0 over 5, and 20 over 5. And so that we fix this row. Now what's left for us is to turn, if I may here, this one, and this one into zeros. So that's where we're going to combine 2 rows together. That's where you see this mess. Okay? So this might be difficult to see, but the idea is to add this row to this row, to add the square to the circle, so that this cancels. So if I multiply -1 to this, because I'm going to do without showing the steps, because it's tough to see here, but let's see. I'm going to multiply -1 times each number in this row. And then I'm going to add it to each number in this row respectfully. And whatever new numbers I get, that's going to replace my first row. So the first row is going to disappear, and I'm going to have new answers. So if I may here, -1 times 1 is -1. -1 plus 1 is 0. That's going to go here. -1 now times +2/5 is -2/5. -2/5 plus 1, which is 5/5, is +3/5 right here. -1 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. -1 times 1/5 is -1/5, plus 0 is -1/5. And so on. -1 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is 0 again. -1 times 0 is 0, plus another 0 is 0. -1 times 4 is -4. Plus 10 is +6. That goes in the first row. So this first thing that I did here resulted in these answers in red. So now notice that I'm going to go R3 now. I'm going to look at these two. So I'm going to multiply again -1 times this row and add it to this one. So -1 times 1 is 1, plus 1 is 0. -1 times 2/5 is -2/5, plus 2 is essentially +8/5. -1 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is 0. -1 times 1/5 is -1/5, plus 0 is -1/5. -1 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. -1 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is also 0. -1 times 4 is -4, plus +36 is +32. And now the last one, to cancel a +1 with a -4, I have to multiply the second row by +4 here. So +4 times 1 is +4, -4 is 0. 4 times 2/5 is 8/5. -3 becomes -7/5 because 3 is 15/5. 4 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is still 0. 4 times 1/5 is 4/5, plus 0 is 4/5. 4 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is 0. 4 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. 4 times 4 times 4 is 16, plus 0 is still 16. So this process that we got zeros here, that was called pivoting. So now you go down to the last row, and if any of these are negative, and these indicators are negative, you have to do the process that I did, all of this here, all of this work here that I did, all of this stuff to get these 4 answers. I got to do the same thing with these 4. So I look here and I say, okay, this is my pivot column. Now I take 6 and divide it by 3/5. Let's see here, 4 and I divide it by 2/5. Let's see, what is that? I'm sorry. The reason I didn't do this one is, I'm sorry, I don't do this one anymore because I already had the pivot to be here. So the middle one's excluded now from the second run. Because it was already, this one was already my pivot row. So that row is already taken care of. So now in the ones that are left, which is 3/5 and 8/5, I do the division. When you divide by 3 over 5, you multiply by the reciprocal, 5/3, you get 10. 32 divided by 8/5 is 32 times 5/8 is 20. So notice the smallest of the two answers is 10. So this is my new pivot. So I need to divide everything here by 3/5, which is the same thing as multiplying everything by 5/3. So I multiply everything by 5/3 here, 0 times 5/3. This guy will become 1. This guy is 5/3. If I multiply this one by 5/3, essentially that becomes the 5's cancel. I have -1/3. This is 0, still 0. 6 divided by 3/5 or multiplied by 5/3 is 10. That's what we got. So now I got to make these other 3 guys 0. So here's the process. And it involves fractions, which kind of sucks, but I need to multiply, to cancel with a positive 2/5, I need a negative 2/5 here. So I'm going to multiply all this by negative 2/5, and I'm going to add all this to it. And that's what I'm going to put in essentially my next page. So negative 2/5 times 0 is 0 plus 1 is 1. Negative 2/5 times 1 is negative 2/5 plus, let's see here, negative 2/5 times row 1 plus row 2, excuse me. That's where you're going to get your 0. Negative 2/5 times 5/3 is negative 2/3 plus 0 is negative 2/3, and etc. Then here I'm going to multiply this one by negative 8/5, all of this, and I'm going to add it to this one and cancel this. Make that a 0. And then positive 7/5 to multiply to be the 1 to add up to this one to make it 0. So I'm going to go through all that pivot. Now I didn't show all the steps because it makes this a lot cleaner. So doing so, if you pivot again a second time, sorry for the mess up there, but it's kind of like so much room for error. Again, this is, you get the zeros down here. So notice that down here now, once you pivot twice, there are no more negative indicators here, no more negative numbers. So this is your what's called your final tableau. In other words, you don't have to go any further. You don't have to do more pivoting. That's essentially your answer here for this. So here's the weird part. Once you go across, whatever column was pivoted, this one, whatever column is pivoted, wherever the ones lie, see that? 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. This, wherever this one lies, that's your answer for that value, for that letter. So x1 equals to 0. x2 equals to 10. And that's how this works. So you have your values for x's. Your basic variables are the ones that are not equal to 0. So your basic variable here is essentially 10. So this is a basic. It turns out that the ones that are 0 are non-basic. So this is a non-basic one and this one's a basic. So when you go down here, this is kind of weird because, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about S3. It actually works out that when you pivot here, notice that these are also pivoted. So S3 is equal to 16, which makes it a basic variable, and also Z is equal to 30 when you're done. So that's your objective value. That's pretty good. So we have x1, x2, we have S3, we have Z, we have these numbers. What's left for these guys, the ones that were not pivoted, those are automatically zeros. So S1 is 0 and S2 is 0. Here's the reasoning. What's left here is 7/3 S1 plus 8/15 S2 plus Z equals to 30. Now, if you know that Z has to be 30, if this has to be 30, if you subtract both sides by 30, these have to add up to be 0. Because they can be non-negative, they can't be negative, they both have to be 0. So pretty much whatever is not pivoted, or whatever doesn't have zeros and on just 1, 1, all of this is 0. S1 is 0 and S2 is 0. These are called essentially non-basic because they're 0. The basic ones are the ones that are going to lead you to your answers. So your x1 value is 0, your x2 value is 10, your s1 value is 0, your s2 value is 0, your s3 value is 16, and your z value is 30. So, and the summarization, this kind of says all that. x1 is 0, s1 is 0, s2 is 0, s3 is 16, and x2 is 10. So these are the values that we got for our variables. This is the maximum value, 30. And this is what they call the simplex method. How do you like that?